Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Fourth Estate. A happy birthday to Kabaka Ronald Mwenda Mutebi and greetings to all of Ugandans. Another African strongman falls after pressure from nationals, with women especially in leadership. President Hassan Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, after 30 years at the helm. He came into power in 1989 and was toppled in 2019 on Thursday. Thursday also happens to be the anniversary, 40-year anniversary, after the overthrow of President Idi Amin Dada from Uganda. What does this mean? Just before Bashir fell, President Abdelaziz Bouteflika of Algeria, under pressure, he's 82 years, had declared he was seeking to stand again, but he hasn't been effective. Actually been in almost a vegetative state since about 2015, but was seeking to stand again after suffering. He had suffered a stroke and wasn't much available in leadership since about 2015, but was seeking re-election. Under pressure from protesters, decided to withdraw and say he will not stand again. In Sudan, just like in Algeria, the immediate leadership promised a transitional government, and protests continued. In Sudan's case, the leader that had taken over immediately after, the former vice president, also almost abdicated and handed over power to another person. We'll be discussing that and its implications, not just for Sudan, but for the African continent as a whole. To discuss that with me tonight, I have Timothy Nyakahuma Kaligira. He's a veteran journalist. He runs an online newspaper. Timothy, very nice to have you. And he's been chronicling the times of Amin and challenging some of the theories that we grew up knowing about Amin's rule over this country, and especially on the question of, did Amin kill 500, or his regime kill 500,000 Ugandans? He's challenging that consistently. I have Captain Mike Mukula, former Member of Parliament for Soroti Municipality, former Minister of Health, and a Pan-Africanist. Very nice to have you.
Thank you. Good evening, listeners.
You're in private business, but you're also the National Vice Chairperson of the National Resistance Movement and a member of the Central Executive Committee. We have with us Fabrice Bradlinda. He's a communication specialist. Fabrice, very nice to have you.
Thank you for having me, Charles, and good evening to all the viewers.
And last but not least, we have Irene Kiza Onyango. She is a veteran journalist, if I should use that, and a media consultant. Very nice to have you, Irene.
Good evening, viewers. Thank you, Charles.
Let me start with you, Timothy, to help us just understand. Yes, the protests in Sudan took a few days, but 2 years ago, President Omar Bashir indicated that he would not be seeking re-election. Pressure had already started mounting. He had lost South Sudan in that referendum, and at 30 years, he was seen as one of the longest-serving leaders, but he's not the longest-serving. Did you expect that he would fall on the Thursday that he fell?
Well, like all events that happen, especially spontaneously, it's very difficult to predict exact moments. He had appeared to be one resistant to this sort of popular pressure, but then, as we've seen, first in Tunisia in 2011, then in Egypt, then in Yemen, sometimes, at least appears in recent years, when the public rises up in discontent, rather than the army sort of taking advantage and staging a coup in secrecy, has now begun acting as some kind of middleman. So the army has developed this doctrine in which it presents itself as a custodian of the state and the constitution, or at least public order, and sort of presumes itself to be the guardian of the state. So you see that not just in Egypt and Algeria and Sudan now, but usually typically in Pakistan, in Thailand, and in Turkey. So I guess now the newly trained officer corps of the last 25 years will now view themselves as an umpire. When the population rise against the leader, then they decide, fine, they're going to intervene. But then, typically, they don't kick out the old order, of which, of course, they are part and parcel. They become an interim administration. And then protesters would expect a revolt and total revolution, now find themselves dismayed with the fact that actually what he had was really more like a palace coup, a high command coup. So that's what happens to them. So in that sense,
would you say the same of Zimbabwe?
very much Zimbabwe, that's an example. Where, remember, the army now is, especially the immediate second generation of the post-colonial army, is integrated in workshops, in business, it's really in building of railways and infrastructure. So in that sense, the army feels it has the same stake in the country as the protesting civilians. And so now I think what you're going to see will be that sort of pattern. Uprising by the masses, the army gets a signal and then feels, well, if this is what's going on, then we read the mood and our response is to remove the head of the government, maintain the security apparatus, the disappointment of the protesters.
Captain, let me come to you. You've interacted at the highest levels, as we can imagine. This almost reads like a line out of the movie No Country for Old Men. And old men in this case, I mean those who have been in power for long.
No, first of all, let's try to understand what caused this uprising. And to me, I don't want to deal with form, I want to deal with content, rather than dealing with the symptoms of the problem. There are about 4 or 5 major problems that were existing or emerging in Sudan that led to this uprising. One was that that in the beginning, from 1956 when Sudan got independence, they have had internal conflicts which have been recurrent in that country. And then again, what happened is that after these multiple coup d'etats that took place inside Sudan, there was also the issue of the war, which had been there for a long time from the south. From 1954, the Anyanya War, which ended in 1972. Again, that took a lot of resources and kept the country down in terms of the social base and economic base of the country. Thereafter, you had the problem in 1980s, I think 77 or thereabouts, when the South again went into war. And you had Colonel Garang, who broke away with most of the bureaucrats and went south for self-determination. And subsequent to that, you realize that there was also the Darfur issue, which wanted self-determination. And then there was the embargo, which was imposed on the Bashir government for Khartoum. Then you realize that when the South eventually got their independence, self-determination, the resources were in the South.
Starting with the signing of the CPA in 2005 and then the referendum in 2011.
The peace accord.
Yes, the peace accord in 2005.
Now, you also realize that when that did happen, most of the resources in Sudan were in the South. Do not forget, Sudan entirely is almost 11 times the size of Uganda. Quite a very big country. If you combine it together with South Sudan, now where it is, it's about 8 times the size of Uganda. A population of 42 million people. But when you look at the resources are in the South. Now, mainly oil. The refinery is in the North. Now, what happened here is that when there was that internal uprising in South Sudan, again after the Sudanese had a problem in the South, the South Sudanese, there was then the emergence of the war in the North, and the South Sudanese destroyed most of the oil installations. So there was a shortfall of oil supply in the North, and again that caused economic hardships. Then what led on was the embargo. That embargo, which was imposed on the West by the atrocities that were committed by Khartoum in Darfur. And you remember Obama was very hard, and it went to the listing of Bashir and calling him into the International Criminal Court when he was indicted. That was another problem. So you'll find that subsequently, the economy was performing very badly. And you note that Khartoum as it were, the economy, 65 to 70% of the population is poor. There are two large cities, Omurdam and Khartoum. And that's where you note that the Sahel, or the Sudan itself, the biggest population is in the urban centers. It is over 70% or 80% of the population is urbanized. Now, all that put into place, you now go into the economic and social political issues that emerged. Now, you realize that the inflation was over 45%. The cost of food rose up because you noted that the Khartoum had a lot of subsidies for bread, wheat, a lot of subsidies for oil, a lot of subsidies for rice. All this was what you call the basic food for the ordinary people. This all of a sudden started rising. The cost of the food started rising, and the rate of unemployment also started coming up. And you note that a population which is poor, the poverty levels are quite high. This internally.
But Captain, you're talking about a country. I hear the description and appreciate that. But you're talking about a country whose GDP per capita is $4,000 US. Compare that with Uganda, which is 750 US. You're worlds apart. You're talking about a leader who, the factors you're talking about, and Timothy would agree, these factors would have toppled Bashir around the time of the Arab Spring, which is 2010-2011. But he'd survived all that. The Americans have eased the embargo against him at the time he falls. Yes, the economy is bad, but South Sudan is functioning again, and therefore oil is beginning to flow back into the refineries of the north. Their agreement over the oil sharing to use their pipeline and refinery is still standing because South Sudan is beginning to hold together, and Bashir is playing a central role in negotiating the peace in the south. Would he have fallen in 2019? Why didn't he fall in 2011? Why didn't he fall in 2013 when the pressure was actually at the highest level?
You will note that these uprisings, or the rebellion, internal uprising, started on the 18th of December. It's now exactly 4 months thereafter. But you note that Bashir was a moderate Islamic, what you call the Muslim Brotherhood. The Sahel, or the Arab factors, come into play. What I want you to note, and what the viewers need to note, is that what caused the internal uprising for example, in Cairo, in Egypt, was the pressure between the Islamic Brotherhood and the other group of the Sunnis, who were the moderates. Now, inside Khartoum, there was an emerging variance between these fundamentalists, who were initially part of the Turabis. The Turabi was the strong man. He's the one who invited and brought on board Al-Qaeda, and he accommodated Osama bin Laden for a long time, until he relocated to to Afghanistan in 1994. But the point I want for you to note is that one of the most fundamental things was there has been an emerging struggle between different fundamental groups within the Arab component.
So you think that his own leadership, his own 30 years in power, has no contribution? I want to put that question to Fabrice, because Captain raises the issue of Hassan al-Turabi. Hassan al-Turabi died 2017, I think about 2017. He had been in jail by Bashir. He had been a very strong man when he was still in government. Then they fall out. Hassan al-Turabi was blamed for propping up the ADF in Uganda, shifting support to the LRA, I think, at some stage.
Yes, in 1994.
Yes.
In a place called Jabalin, 42 kilometers south of Juba.
Yes, he was blamed for all those. Then he falls out with Bashir. He ends up in jail. And actually, died, I think, about 2017 or 2018. I'm not quite sure.
1.5 years ago.
Yeah, about 1.5 years ago. He's long dead. So you can't say that the dead man and his formations are the ones facilitating the overthrow of a guy who has been in power for 30 years, would you?
No, I wouldn't, but I don't think that's what Captain is also saying. I think where he's coming from is there are very many factors that come into play when it comes to the fall of Bashir. Primary of those, we have to look at the unemployment and the food crisis. There have been many governments that have fallen because of bread. A simple thing as that. Understanding
Starting with the French monarchy.
Yes, we can start with the French Revolution.
Yes.
It started all around the price of bread. But to talk about Sudan, you have to look at the factors he was talking about. You have to look at the unemployment. You have to look at what had become of these urbanized people. I heard you talk about the difference between Uganda and Sudan in terms of GDP. But our people's food or feeding is not necessarily based on what they earn in terms of cash. We have a huge percentage of people who are agriculturalists that actually grow and keep their food. That's livestock that gives them food. So the basic thing is when you mess with a man's stomach, they will go to no. They will stop at no. They will have no stops.
You make him angry.
Yes. So these people's, I think Bashir delayed to get a solution to his problem. From December when this started, instead of finding an actual solution, I think he thought this is a thing that will blow over. He underestimated it, and it has taken him.
Irene, let me come to you. Timothy draws a very critical factor into this discussion: the role of the military. People have been since Thursday. People have been trying to bring into play President Yoweri Museveni visiting all these barracks in the last few days. He's still continuing visiting all these barracks, and they're saying, what exactly is he trying to stem on this? Though I wouldn't, personally, I wouldn't compare. I wouldn't bring the factors that of the Arab Spring and what led to the overthrow of Bashir to play into Uganda. I do not think, because I think we're two different, completely different societies. But you see the role of the military in Zimbabwe. Actually, there they take the lead and the population follows. In Egypt, they stand in the middle in 2011, and they refuse to shoot at the population. In Algeria, same story. In Tunisia, almost same story. Libya became a little bit different, but in Sudan, you have not seen protests that have run for as long as they have. It actually creates for me the best comparison with Uganda. In Uganda, we had one major demonstration, major fallout with Buganda and the NRM government, September 2009, and you had 29 people falling, dead, shot. In Sudan, you have protests that have run for days. You do not have the numbers of deaths, of killings, as we have had elsewhere. And then where the military position itself, but also the anti-climax that he's talking about. Egypt is the best example. Sudan, sorry, I keep repeating South. Sudan presents one of the best examples of an abortion of a people's revolution. How do you see, how will this play out going forward in the future? How does this help people who think they can demonstrate, protest, and change government if the military is taking such a key position?
I wouldn't think it's about what the people are going to do or not do. But for me, the success of the demonstrations and everything has a lot to do with the duration in power, the duration that that particular government has spent in power. Now, for example, in Sudan, they've created different groups, the militia groups. I mean, who is fighting against the other? Because, you cannot always expect people to be standing with you when you have created small clusters. I have this strong feeling that at one point, some people are saying these people are against, it's us against the other. The revolution is eating within itself, so to speak. So what happens is, at one point, there are people who would want to say, maybe we need a change. And then there are those who are probably saying, we need to go this way. So You know, you reach a point where even the military knows that the safest thing to do is to listen to the demonstrators. That's what I think. And you know, not to, because you see, you look at this person and say, this person is not going anywhere. He has reached where he has reached, where he can reach, so to speak. So if you're wise enough, you just take sides. But also, it has another side to it. How do we know if people have not sat, since there are all those, you know, loyalties of serving for so many years? How do you know if people have not sat somewhere and said, you know what, let me be the weak one now? Then the military looks like it is on the side of the demonstrators, but just to make people shut up.
You're looking at the GDP ratios. That's the question you raised.
She's looking at the period of service.
That
Period in power,
yes,
30 years.
Yes.
That could
I
also
mean,
be a
it
factor.
it gives you a big base. We can't know what you're doing. We can't know if you're staging a coup against yourself. You know me, I've never believed this Zimbabwe thing. There are some things I don't believe. You know, I don't believe some things.
You don't believe that Mnangagwa is a president in his own right?
I don't think so.
And that Chiwenga actually led that
I
coup
don't.
against Comrade Bob.
This,
You-
you know,
you-
they said
you-
we are so tired of this person, and then the person is everywhere.
I really seriously think that Comrade Bob is still in charge from the Blue Roof.
I think he is.
Well, that's one way to look at it. But does power actually in Africa, does it actually change?
Does it change?
That
That's
is the question. If we're going to talk about that, let's have a look at other African countries that have had a coup d'etat. You had Mobutu, who was president from 1967 till 1997. When Kabila takes over in 1997 with the help of Uganda and Rwanda, he becomes president. Here's the situation. It is the same exact people. If you go to Kinshasa today, the guys who have been in politics in Congo are the same guys who have been in politics in Congo since Mobutu's time. The guys who are ministers, people like Kengo Adondo, who was prime minister, was until recently he was Senate president in Congo. You go and look at Zimbabwe. The ministers are the same. Nothing has really changed. And it is a place, look at Egypt, look at Libya. Have they actually changed? Because it's the same guys. Because it's one thing to blame, and I see that a lot in Africa. We blame an individual and not necessarily the group. So you have a change of guard. Basically, it is Captain Mike stops being president, Fabrice takes over, but they are the same guys. They are from the same clique.
Yeah.
So what happens? There is no way Captain Mike is going to go after me or what I've done or change much, because what he knows is what we've been doing all along.
But you also need to note that the case of Sudan, for that matter, was an intervention to save the institution, also an intervention to ensure that they preserve the status quo. That's why you find that this general, or the Minister of Defense, who was also the Vice President, was in power for 30 hours. 30 hours. But the critical thing is that because the population remained in the streets, they said, no, this is a change of guard. They now said, let's bring another person. And the person was the chief of staff, again, who was part of the institution. So this is a self-preservation. And I would want you to note that when you have that situation, it's important for you to note that Bashir had entrenched himself in the last so many years. He had deeply entrenched himself so that those who were around him were all part of the institution. So now the question is, would you think that those who took over power would sell themselves out and sell their leader to International Criminal Court and let him be indicted? No. And that's why
He's
you say
already
that,
indicted. They only need to hand him
yes,
over.
to hand him over. Now the question is, at this stage, it is important for you to note that the best way around it now is to have a negotiated settlement. Because if you have a fully fledged showdown, you will note that those who are royalists to the institution, those who have the arms, who are bearing the arms, will not find it very difficult to hand over the institution to another opposition group. And take note, when I talked about Turabi, the largest political party in Khartoum is the party that belonged, or that was founded by Turabi. And that's why you note that the institution, as it were, and those who are in the opposition are still fighting to preserve themselves. The Turabi group, the main opposition group, is trying as much as possible using the popular uprising to take over power.
Yeah,
But the
because
institution
you have
of
an
Bashir will
uprising
not
that
hand over
doesn't
that
have
power.
a leadership, just like you had in Egypt. The protesters do not have a formalized leadership. There is nobody specifically that they are looking to as their leader. You saw that emerge in Egypt in 2011, and you see it playing out again. But Timothy, let me come to you. There's a question here from Monteja Semwe, but for Captain Mike Mukolan says, the problem of Africa is leaders who overstay in power. Discuss the validity of this statement. You'll discuss the validity afterwards. But Timothy, you raised the argument about the role of the military. If you scan across the African continent, what exactly is that role, and where does that leave those yearning for change against those who already have the power?
Well, that's why I began by saying that in the 1960s, the colonial or just pre-colonial army was typically sort of like fenced off from the civilian population. There was a civilian government, and the army was in the barracks. Gradually, over the decades, the army sort of like becomes kind of like a political-economic player in the state. They have industries, they have sports teams, they build bridges, dams, repair bridges, that sort of thing. So, as it is in North Africa especially, and the countries I mentioned in the Middle East and Asia, Turkey, Thailand, Pakistan, those three in particular. You might say even in Latin America, the Brazils, and to some degree Cuba, Argentina, that sort of military that is more than just a bearer of arms and a defender of the country's borders, but that it's somewhat like what Uganda developed after the 1979 war, this idea of needing to have army members in parliament. Because then it's more than, as I said, it's more than just a guard of honor, it teased attention, but also a thinking army, educated people that went to the Sandhursts and the other military academies. So that sort of politicized army that feels that it being what it is, the most organized unit in the state, or single most organized unit of state, then has a right to prevent the country from disintegrating. So in all this officer corps training they do in Nigeria and Egypt and different armed forces academies, is the principle of you're not just passive onlookers with guns as the country falls apart. You must step in at a critical moment to defend the state from total collapse. So that, I think, is what the North African military is engaged in right now, and which we see in Sudan. This idea that many of us have, usually after the facts, we become wise. But let me just ask a question. Supposing Bashir was still in power today, what would we be saying on this show right now?
We'll
then be saying, well, Bashir is one of those, then we'll look for Mugabe.
Maybe we'll be discussing a different topic.
No, yes, exactly.
Must we discuss? We wouldn't discuss a story that's not new.
If they're escalating
yes.
to a crisis, the Tahrir squares of Cairo and, Port Sudan and Atbara were filled with people. It was close to a tipping point, but Bashir was still in power. What we'll be saying, then we'll start working backward to these facts and then say, well, in Sudan, the army is. So sometimes we who comment on these things kind of beat about the bush, a bit like the Sudanese army. So you can see the fact that you can have a Minister of Defense take power and then in less than 2 days has resigned clearly shows you that there wasn't a premeditated long-term plan. Sometimes events just fall upon people. Sometimes, history just runs faster than the actors, and then you wake up and say, what do we do? Like the 71 coup. When these soldiers come to Idi Amin and say, you're going to be president. Amin says, me? He said, yes, you. And so it's like, Amin says, so what do we do? We're going to make fools of ourselves. Let's get all the educated professors from Akere, make them ministers. Anyway, we'll discuss that later. So in other words,
we'll come to the
history doesn't always follow a logical, premeditated,
Or when Museveni drives to pick Benais and tell him you're president now.
Sometimes
and then says, okay,
happen.
I'm president.
Yes. During the Buganda riots that I mentioned earlier, on the second day, the Thursday, I think it was the 10th or 11th, they had actually prepared the presidential jet to flee this country, and then the rioting falls apart. So a few people said, if those youths had actually realized how much close, if the people power then had realized today, things would be different. So life is a bit like these football matches. A chaos in motion, radical, rational to some degree, but also events overtaking the players. The players both causing the events and also responding to events.
Captain, this question has also come, the same question has come from Peter Majela. He says the problem of Africa is leaders who stay in power for too long. At the time President Museveni made this statement, less than 5 leaders in Africa had ruled beyond 15 years. The longest in Uganda had ruled for 8 years, and 60% of post-independence leaders had been replaced. This was a wrong diagnosis to the problem. I have been asking myself this question for a long time, that when Yoweri Museveni said the problem of Africa is leaders who stay in power for too long, who was he referring to at that time? And looking back now,
I think let's look at
you to discuss.
Let's look at it now.
Yes.
I think the question was African leaders who stay in power and become dictators without having regular elections.
So
the question here.
Are you suggesting, Captain, now that it's okay to become a dictator with regular elections?
What makes you a dictator?
No. You
said can't have both. You can't be a dictator.
You said African leaders who stay in power, who become dictators.
You can't have
get now a dictocracy.
You cannot have elections at the same time. Be a dictator.
You can.
No, you can't.
You can't.
What's the definition of a dictator?
Dictatorship is not about
what's the definition?
Autocracy. Autocracy.
It's about absence of elections.
No.
Yes.
You can have elections because, for example, how does a person like Cecilia Gwal get elected? How does Okumu Reagan get elected?
How come Saddam Hussein had been elected with 99% of the vote?
That is
just
Saddam
Hussein. Before they overthrew him.
That is Saddam Hussein.
No, it's dictatorship.
You mean
they are different?
No. Let's get one point. Let's get one point right.
Definitions for dictatorship.
Let's get one point right. That's your description.
Yes.
I also have my position.
Yes.
The point is that
the definition is standard.
When you are when you carry out regular elections, and right from the grassroots upwards, and people can be able to present themselves for elections, even at parliamentary level, at the presidential level, and people have a right to choose. That's what you call democracy.
Yes, and I can tell you.
The voice of the people.
Yes, and Captain, I can tell you that all these countries where we have seen people fall, that we have across the board called dictators, hold those regular elections.
Are we vilifying? The one?
And they win with very good percentages. I was in Zimbabwe for the 2013 elections. They had an election just before Mugabe fell. They were supposed to be going to an election, and they have had an election. Bashir has been elected repeatedly. Bashir, they've been holding elections. In Egypt, they were holding elections. In Iraq, they were holding elections. But when they fall, they earn the moniker dictators. Before they fall, we discuss whether regular elections mean dictatorship or not.
You see, your description of the dictatorship is something that I would like to have deeply discussed.
Yes, sure.
My position is the moment you have regular elections, and you know very clearly a person like the mayor of Kampala, would, if we were to impose a leader, he could have done it. But he is popularly elected by the masses of Kampala district, as it were. Now, you have also seen, when I discuss, for example, Kampala generally, Kampala district, most of the leading members of parliament are from the opposition. That's what you call democracy. If we imposed, as a ruling party, leaders into governance in those various counties or various constituencies, then that is dictatorship, autocracy. But the point I'm trying to say is that it's because of the weaknesses that are inherent in the opposition. I have never seen in my life and in my entire democratic process a disjointed, disorganized political organization as it were today. And that's why I want to say that NRM prevails purely on the basis of a weak opposition. And we will not go in and discuss and strengthen the capacity of the opposition. Our position here is to ensure that we win elections. And if it were even any other party that was here, it would ensure that it would work towards preserving and holding power. And that is what political parties are all about.
Okay, I'm afraid, Irene, we need to take a quick commercial break. But I'll take these two messages. Nteja Sim again says, Captain Mukula, What is the quality of those elections you are referring to? Are you talking about elections or selections? You know, in selections, you might actually pick what you did not intend or deliberately to balance your vote, if I should use that. Let's take a quick commercial break. I wanted to take a message from Assad Mugenyi, who says the Sudanese Professionals Association are the leaders of the protests. Those will lead the civilians in the transition government. When the SPA leaders showed their faces, they were arrested and tortured. They have since preferred to remain in the shadows. So professionals are taking center stage somewhere there. Anthony Maseke is watching us and says, is Captain Mike Mukula seriously suggesting that we have free and fair elections in Uganda with all the violence currently being visited on FDC and other opposition parties? How can they mobilize to compete fairly? You came from Eastern Uganda and you must have seen the chaos that was in Jinja just yesterday. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue with this discussion. Captain, can you read for us that definition of dictator? Because we're talking about it when you're on air. You asked your phone to tell us who is a dictator. What is a dictatorship? So read it for us, please.
It's very simple. A dictatorship is an authoritarian form of government characterized by a single leader or group of leaders with either no party or weak party, with little mass mobilization.
Okay.
Now you can see
So dictatorship,
little mass
that
mobilization. Little mass mobilization.
That definition for
and
you
no
and
elections.
Fabrice.
That's
For
what
you
it
and
says.
Fabrice, it doesn't talk about elections, does it?
It talks about elections.
No, it says
talks about
little
elections.
or no, a leader who
Mass
stays in power
mobilization.
for long, and we're talking about a leader who's been in power for 30 years and overthrown after 30 years. Obviously, with a weak party, little or no mass mobilization or mobilization of the population.
That is for Sudan, but Uganda. You're talking about Uganda. We're discussing.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, the question was
okay,
about
it's okay.
Uganda.
It's okay.
If we are discussing Uganda,
No, you found
we will
the
come in for another
you
day.
found the definition,
But
and
here,
that's what I was interested in.
the point here
Yes.
is mobilization is the arrangement of making sure that you have an independent electoral commission. You galvanize, mobilize the population towards an election and ensure that they line up and vote in a free democratic process.
Thank you
It
very
may
much.
not be perfect, but all elections,
talked
even
about-
the United States,
You're
have never
talking
been
about
perfect.
an independent electoral commission,
Yes.
a free and fair election,
Yes.
as free as can be in the circumstances.
That's correct.
I think you've read for us the definition. That's important.
I want to
Irene, you
just
wanted to say
add
something
something, because-
just before you took the break. Yes.
Yes, because the President Museveni said the problem in Africa is leaders that stay in power for long. I just want to qualify his statement. I think Africa's biggest problem is leaders that stay in power for long and stop listening to the masses. That is our biggest problem. Because in 2013,
Have they stopped listening, actually?
they stopped.
When?
In 2013, there was a serious uprising in Sudan. And you know what happened? There were so many demonstrators that came out. We all know that 170 people were killed. Is it 170 or more? We were killed just because they got out to say the food prices are so high. So I think our biggest problem is not even people staying in power for so long, but people reach that point where they come out and demonstrate. If somebody says life or death, I don't care what it is, it means there is something they are not getting. Maybe they vote, maybe, but what is it that they want that you're not giving them?
I can see here Primo has sent a fairly long message. Let me retrieve it and read it. Yes, sir. Primo says, good evening, Charles. Informed the panel that Bashir fell because of the following. Number one, much as he thought he was too strong, but he realized that the army, especially the non-commissioned officers who protected or sided with the protesters, made the greatest decision on his part because they are the majority. The generals, that's number two, the generals were from his clan and close associates, but are, of course, fewer in number, therefore decided to side with the non-commissioned officers who had already diverted loyalty. I know they will soon face the general back in the barracks when the general who's taken over. He adds and says that number three, the bread issue was the major one, but without the support of the soldiers, those protesters would have been crushed. So those leaders who put much trust in the army should be very careful. No wonder General Museveni is visiting the barracks around Uganda. That's a message from Primo. Just for contextual purposes, General Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, especially in the Darfur sub-region. He should have been taken and handed over to the ICC. There was a protest and the court case in South Africa when he visited, and the South African government failed to arrest him and hand him over. Then he came to Kampala. He was the main guest at President Museveni's last swearing in 2016.
Yes.
And together with the leader who took over from him immediately, the one who Captain talked about here, who lasted for only 36 hours, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan.
Was also his.
He's also he was vice president.
Vice president.
Was an in-law.
Yes.
Married to his cousin.
Yes, and they're indicted together, by the way, by the International Criminal
His
Court.
niece,
Yes, and now General Awad, it's General Awad bin Auf who took over immediately. He's later handed over to General Abdel Fattah. I want to come to the question we're discussing about, one, the role of the military, the leaders who have stayed in power, and my bigger question, Timothy, to you is, why do you think Bashir survived the first wave of the Arab Spring till now?
As I said, I guess the longer one understands world history, the more one sees two things. One is general patterns of forces that we, the analysts, try and make patterns out of. And sometimes it's just sworn events, ordinary events, which much later the leaders will tell you in their memoirs, or let's say when you hear recollections of their officials after they've retired, that sometimes it's just the accidents of history. We try to see a pattern, because you could ask and say, if it's the Arab Spring, why does it skip Morocco, go through Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, skip Sudan for the time being, goes to Yemen, then doesn't touch a single Gulf state, and so on. So is that a pattern or not? If we look at the uprisings in Zimbabwe, so why not in Zambia, Malawi, and some other countries? Why then is there an uprising by the population in Burkina Faso, but then coups in Niger and Guinea, then Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania to 2008? So sometimes it's just one of those things. It's just like we're sitting in a studio, and then like where the ceiling falls on us, and it's just that. And then,
and the corner here protects me.
Exactly. Falls on everyone else, and then we begin thinking, well, you see the things that Captain Nkula survived. Well, then how come he survived and we all died? Well, in aviation they train these pilots to be, but maybe he just happened to sit the right place just after you. Or let's say like what happened in 2014, a Malaysian plane vanishes over the Pacific.
MH370.
Yes, and then 4 months later, a plane is shot down over flying from Amsterdam. It shot over, I think.
Was that
Ukraine.
MH170?
What's that? A Malaysian airline plane, and people say Malaysia again. So we start like this recent Boeing 737 MAX 8. We begin looking for patterns. There's a MAX 8 in Lion Air. There's a MAX 8 in Ethiopian Airlines. There's something wrong with the MAX 8. Or Malaysian Air, maybe this thing is cast. So it's just that. Sometimes events just happen that way. How come we're not discussing Ethiopia, where there's a crisis, internal crisis like in Sudan, where the prime minister decides to resign, and then we have this reformer, Prime Minister Ahmed Abiy. So sometimes it's just one of those things. It's an event that happens individually for very particular reasons, and as you can see with the army in Sudan, it's unprepared for this. They rise up to try and contain the situation, and then they haven't thought through who is going to succeed the other. And even now, they're just gambling their way, kind of like lifting the curfew that they'd imposed, and then say 2 years of a transition, and then maybe if there's more potency, they might say, okay, it's fine to be 1 year. So, as I said, like in a football match, you are just improvising as you get
along.
Yes.
Fabrice, let me come back to you. Bashir enjoyed a very special relationship with Uganda, and special in a way because with this particular regime of President Museveni, he came 3 years after President Museveni had taken over. They fought initially, disagreed. Sudan, the early Sudan was throwing bombs in northern Uganda, in West Nile, were apparently told, delivering supplies to the ADF in the Rwenzoris, through the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire. Then afterwards, Uganda actually was one of those countries pushing for Bashir's indictment. He gets indicted and we have been his biggest defenders. Said you can fly out of Sudan to visit other countries and we'll give you protection. You remember in 2016, he came for the swearing in of President Museveni. He was the main guest.
And European Union.
The American ambassador walked out in protest because the president was attacking them. What would you say now that he's fallen? And he's been a central player together with President Museveni in trying to forge peace in South Sudan. What does his departure mean for the South Sudan peace?
Well, I think South Sudan is at I don't see him leaving becoming a big factor for the peace of South Sudan. In what way? One, I still think President Museveni plays a very key role for South Sudan's peace. The other thing that I think that we need to consider is the fact that these guys sort of have their relationship is one of those that's being glued together, and you can't necessarily tell where it's going to go. It's one of those. I saw the Pope. They have agreed to work together because the Pope shocked them and kissed their feet. I really hope that really keeps them together. South Sudan's issues or the relationship between the leaders is one of those that is extremely unpredictable. Today, fine, Riek Machar may agree to work together, but you just don't know when another general may decide, you know what, I want my turn at this. I want to support Captain a bit when the question the person asked about overstaying power. I think as Africans, we have one problem. When we look at overstaying power or leaders, let's look at that word leaders. It is extremely hilarious that you find somebody that has been in parliament as long as we've had parliament also saying these guys have overstayed in power. I think both sides.
Why not?
Because you're doing the same thing.
No, the level of your decision making and the impact you have on a country.
You
is
see,
different.
Charles,
Yes.
if you're going to talk about transition, if you're going to talk about democracy, if you're going to talk about giving chance to other people, it should start from the lowest level. You'll find some villages where a person has been LC1 from the time there was a creation of that position. You'll find an MP who's been in there, Captain Mike Mukula here can tell you how many people he found in that house, how many he left in that house. You'll find people who they have been district chairman since that position came up. You'll find some people who will die to be ministers every time. You'll find some people who are dying to retain ownership, let me call it that, or to be heads of the opposition. I think when we talk about change, like it was rightfully said, be the change you want to see. Let's start with saying, okay, you know what? Let's give the young people a chance. As everyone is pushing, it's time for the young people. But you want...
Fabrice, I'm having difficulty making sense of your argument in this way, with all due respect. You see, the level of impact that a presidential decision has on a country and on a population is far, far less than a member of parliament who represents far less.
Far more.
No.
Okay.
Far more rather than a member of parliament who represents a single constituency tucked away in some corner of the country. In some of these constituencies, they represent less than 10,000 people. They have no resources to distribute. They have no power to dispense. All they have is themselves sitting in that parliament and earning the parliament salary. Now, that person compares fundamentally differently from another who, like the Americans would say, controls the nuclear code.
Okay.
No senator has control over the nuclear code.
That's a given.
No House representative in the US has control over the nuclear code. So if you're looking at staying power, the presidency and other positions, especially where we have very powerful presidencies, like we do have in parts of this world, I think the debate is fairly different.
No, it's not. I'll give you where I'm coming from.
Yes.
Etienne Tshisekedi in Congo was the longest serving, I think, opposition leader in a country. He has finally gotten, his son finally got in whether you call it fairly or whatever, he got in, he's now the president of the country.
Yes.
Now, here's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying they have the same level of decision making, but what I'm saying is, if you can't even give room for someone else to take a turn at trying to get that seat, you don't have a moral authority to say, because leadership in a country is not necessarily just the people in State House. No, it's not. Even the opposition is a leadership in a country.
Okay.
The country has arms of government. The legislative is one of them. Decision making is taken there. The laws or the laws of a country are made there. So you cannot dismiss the fact that the leadership, if you talk about the longevity, the staying power that is long, you cannot dismiss. You see, you can't fault one and not the other.
Who's the longest serving member of if they call it a parliament in Sudan? Who's the longest serving?
No, I don't know.
You wouldn't know?
No.
Who's been the longest serving president of Sudan?
Omar al-Bashir. Yes, it is.
You say? Okay.
It is.
But
is that a change of leadership?
Okay, I think
let's take a message.
let's get one key point. Let me just very quickly
Can you
respond.
take these messages and then come to your back? Yes. Bernard Imperio says, I think a dictator president is one who goes against the legitimate decisions of the elected bodies,
No, it's like
parliament.
It's like we're in class.
We
or
see this
someplace
in
or
a
something.
president.
Forget these people's messages. Let's discuss Sudan.
Those are the people who are the reason you're here.
We are dictators. This is our show.
Charles.
It's not the audience.
It's talking a dictatorship.
I think
Charles.
dictatorship
Yes,
is
Captain.
ABC Advanced Learners
Charles,
Dictionary.
let's get one thing.
Sure.
People who want to read and want to learn and suffer from intellectual laziness should deepen their knowledge in the dictionaries and go into Google. And we'll get to understand what it is. But the point is that governance are laid out by rules of the game. And that's where the Constitution comes in. The powers of the president in a democratic society are clearly spelled out, are drawn in the Constitution. Anybody who exercises powers outside the constitutional norms is the one you call a dictator. But you see, autocracy and a benevolent dictator is different from a man who dispenses powers dispensed or given to him by the Constitution. So the point I'm trying to get here, and that's what Fabrice was trying to elucidate on, let's get this point very clearly. Anywhere or any time you play outside the rules of the game, then you are not being fair to the rules of the game. And that's where dictatorship comes in. So I want to say that you would have cited any of these oversights, and that's why Parliament is there, to carry out oversight and checks and balances, to ensure that you play within the rules of the game. And that's why the supremacy of the Constitution prevails.
Okay. This is Ivan Okuda. He's watching us from South Africa, Johannesburg. He says, greetings to my former MP, Captain Mike. His analysis on Sudan is quite solid. However, Timothy makes the most basic and fundamental point in my view, that sometimes things happen that defy even the sophistication of the most clever politician, as history across the world shows. You can't postpone change forever. Fabrice equally asks a very important question. Is there change that actually happens in these revolutions? What's the quality of that change? And does it really speak to the aspirations of the people when the dust settles? It's proven in most Arab Spring Africa to be a mere change of guards. Can the panel comment on possibilities of foreign influence in these transitions? Timothy.
You know, anyway, this is where my conspiracy side comes in.
Please go ahead. If you've seen the seer in the last few...
No. You know, I've been watching some of these world events. Every single Arab country, let's say Arab country, that has ever tried to get nuclear weapons has either been broken up or had these sorts of regime changes we've seen in Sudan now, in Iraq, the attempt in Syria, and so on. There's some reports I saw in 2005 at the time South Sudan was broken up, and the role of the Israeli intelligence in the breakup of that country is where I begin to think, yes, these riots have been going on, and yes, it's a homegrown uprising, disgruntlement of a price and all these things. But from the days that Captain Mukula mentioned, from the Anyanya Revolution, there's always been that thing of Israel and Sudan. Even the 71, you know, that side, there's that side of Israel, you know, Uganda being a rear base to watch this country at the southern tip of the Arab North Africa. You can pick up on that. It's, yes, it's spontaneous, but if I know that sly country in the Middle East, to answer the question of foreign influence, please don't discount it. Even Darfur, by the way, this idea of, you know, al-Bashir killed 300,000 people in Darfur, it's another of these Idi Amin stories. When you actually go deep into the story of Darfur and such, and al-Bashir said about people, Darfur is like the home of Islam in Sudan, the way you might say, let's say what, maybe old Kampala is the home of Islam in Uganda. Or let's say Chibuli is, or let's say maybe Entebbe, the rival of the White Fathers, you know, those things. This is, I can't be an part of the Islamic Brotherhood, I'm killing all these people. So I think even Professor Mahmoud Mamdani hinted at that. This idea of figures of killings that are politicized when Security Council resolutions are nearby. But al-Bashir would go there and dance, you know, as he always did and such. And it was another of those stories. And then Darfur itself, leaders of the Darfur uprising were seen in Israel meeting the Israeli government ministers and intelligence officers. That's why I think that this Darfur thing is part of, and I'm usually pro-Israel, but I'm saying it could be part of this Israel attempt to break this country that was always under the radar of Israel. That's just my theory.
You think Bashir didn't contribute to his own downfall?
Okay, in a very generic sense, but remember that this idea all around the world, we're all advocating for democracy, which is very much a European, you know, Judeo-Christian concept. But in many of these countries, it's not seen the way it's seen here. Like, for example, the perception of women's rights and, let's say, you know, marriage relations is very different in a typical North European country than it is from, let's say, Pakistan. So if you, or let's say this, the best example, this whole question of gay rights and such, things that we find like abominable in our countries are normal in the Western world. So if you see the Ugandan parliament voting against, let's say, gay law, and it sounds, and it's 97%, you say, what's wrong with those people? You don't understand, but in their culture, they're doing the least they can do for their societies. So
Brunei just passed a law, actually.
exactly,
Yes,
against
Yes.
And then Digenez has been leading a protest against a boycott of their business interests in America.
So in a generic sense, yes, there was the usual mismanagement of the complexities of running these countries. But other people also, these Sudanese are also, one of the reasons for that demonstration, like I had yesterday from some of these Sudanese, like what Ethiopians got hated Meles now with the Prime Minister for. You allowed Eritrea to go away. We were once one great country, you broke it up. Why did you allow South Sudan to break off?
Henry Mteve makes the point you're making, actually. He says he makes the same point as you're making. He says, in my view, the fall of Bashir is a hangover effect of the breakaway of the South. Sudan lost 3/4 of its revenue. After the signing of the CPA in 2005, Sudan started remitting 50% of all revenues generated from production in the South. In 2011, after the referendum in the South, Sudan's economy sharply contracted. Can you imagine what would happen if Uganda lost half revenue? In an effort to salvage the situation, to increase foreign reserves and get needed cash to import, it removed critical subsidies that drove the prices of fuel up.
And even inflation.
The effect was an increase in prices of vital items like food, bread. This also drove inflation up to over 70%. As the condition became worse and riots broke out, some sections within his own party complained and sided with the protesters. He broke ranks with them, and he never recovered from that mess. He lost so many allies during these turbulent times. Seeing that Bashir had become a liability, the army felt motivated to step in and fill the political vacuum. Sudan will still feel the tremors of the South Sudan's breakaway even after Bashir. Captain, you wanted to come in, and then we'll take a break. I'll start with you after.
I would also want you to note that from the time the riot started, on the 18th of December, there was an attempt for Bashir to get support from Qatar and also get support from Turkey, and in order to try to deal with the rising food prices. And that also lasted for about 2 months. And he ran out of cash. Now, when he ran out of cash, and which is a fact, If he had had the money, if Bashir had the money, he would have even been able to pay some of the people who were in the opposition. He would have been able even to bring them on board and discuss, and maybe found out they would have gotten a negotiated settlement to the problem. But the problem kept getting deeper and deeper, and the Sudan factor, the South Sudan factor, contributed hugely to the problems in Khartoum. Secondly, the embargo. You see, that embargo also contributed for 20 years, contributed tremendously to the compression of the economy. And then thirdly, these internal contradictions that emerged also fueled the problem. Now, you know that the external play, the Israelis, the Americans, and also those who were opposed to him, who believed that he was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, again also put in a lot of money. And if you note, every Friday, every Jummah, every time they went for the prayers, you know, Muslims pray 5 times a day. But every time they went on for prayers on Friday, the snowball effect will be built. And you know that it will be a rallying point for the entire community to cause an uprising. And I want to say
So
that
the demonstration will start immediately after Friday
immediately
prayers.
after prayers, after the Jummah prayers.
But one question that never
Basically,
gets...
so the idea was make Sudan like Venezuela.
Yes, but
Ungovernable.
And they had a
Venezuela, the
rallying
Americans
point.
have failed up to now to push out Maduro.
Yes, because
Yes, he's
they
still
are
in charge.
failing, you see, Charles, and that's why you get most people are getting it wrong. These guys had a common problem, which was the prices of things. Now, all these other places you're talking about, people have failed to get a common point where they say, okay, this is the point of rallying. Because you see, the common man, if you talk about, if you look at all these places, I'm realizing everyone here has sort of not talked about Libya. Because you see, Libya, the guys who were actually fighting were not the Libyans themselves. Okay? We can go into conspiracy theories and all that. But you see, all these other places, there was a common rallying point, a common rallying factor.
I'm afraid we need to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll pick this up. One of the questions that none of us, or we are refusing to discuss, part of the panel is refusing to discuss, is the question of the contribution of the person who holds power. Because for Gaddafi, he failed to negotiate in time. He had been in power for 42 years. He failed to find that critical moment when you negotiate, Captain, what you're talking about. Bashir has been caught in the same. Hosni Mubarak was caught in the same. Tunisia was caught in the same. Apart from a few who were able to say, okay, we can actually agree on something and I get out. Why is it that the leaders will stay up to the last minute when they get humiliated before they can negotiate and manage their transition? Kabila has done it. Kabila did it most effectively.
But he had tried.
Yeah, he tried,
He
but
had tried.
he knew when things wouldn't move further. Why do these others not know that it's gotten worse? Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll discuss that together with 40 years after the fall of Idi Amin. Welcome back to this last segment of the fourth estate. And I want to start with you, Irene.
Yes.
Irene, why is it that all these leaders, no matter who you talk about, fail to know things have gone south? I can't salvage it now. I need to negotiate my way out. It sent Gaddafi into a tunnel. It sent Mubarak into a cage where he had kept his opponents. Bashir has ended up being forced out. Almost all of them get forced out. Yeah, Saddam ended up in a hole, but actually, when they were executing him, his head was chopped off. Why is it that the leaders, especially after staying in power for that amount of time, are not able to know where we are now? I can't salvage this. I need to negotiate. A dignified exit.
I think the longer you stay in power, the longer it is, the more it is difficult for you to even see. They need to move, they need to change anything, they need to listen to anyone. There's something you start feeling, because like the saying goes, power corrupts. You know, you start thinking, I can't fail. Somebody's going to do this. And then, people start surrounding you. And when they surround you, they start telling you the things you want to hear. Because the question you're asking is the question we keep asking ourselves. Some of us have been supporters of our government, and with this passion, and then all the time we keep hearing things and wondering, when is this person going to say, this is how I'm going to move? I mean, when there's no clear succession plan, like we've all been saying, not only in the NRM, that is the ruling party, but even in the opposition. The reason why people are fighting is because, people don't know where we are going. Like Timothy was saying, everybody just doesn't know what is going to happen. We leave it to a game of chance. That is I don't know if it's an African thing. I don't even believe it's an African thing. Those people who die, they are so rich, and then there's no will. Because for some reason they think they will be here forever and steer everyone forever.
You think you're cursing yourself if you write a will?
Yes. And then some people think if
And
they're still alive, you may be alive, but sometimes you reach a point where your brain can't think further than, than certain things. You need to understand that point is going to come. You probably need to have, when people see some kind of, however vague it is, if they see some kind of transition, then they will not start panicking. But everybody starts thinking, no, this is what is going to happen. And then these people are brought on their knees. Why? Because people don't see a clear way. They don't
she announced
see.
2 years ago that you would not be seeking re-election. 2 years ago.
Too little, too late. That's what I want to see.
I think part of his problem is that he actually wasn't intent on following through his promise.
He wasn't. He had said so many things. People, sometimes you say so many things. We've had those things being said here in Uganda, but then these people come and say, we want a sole candidate. And this happened only in NRM. The party president of FDC said, whether you like it or not, the person that is coming to stand is Dr. Besigye. No discussions. Let me say, you don't expect people to say anything. You'll be brought down on your knees somehow.
Fabrice,
yes.
The same question, because it's intriguing. People have been arguing, and I've been thinking over, I think Timothy will develop it better. I've been thinking over some time, externalization of conflict on the African continent. Here, we're seeing so much about that external influence. Yes, it is there. We expect it to be there. But to say that it's the external influence that swings us wherever we go. The other thing I would think about is most African countries, I think about 57, 60, 61 years after independence. In the next round of independence celebrations, you're talking about countries 57, 60 years, 58, 59, 60, 61 for majority of the African countries. And they're still telling you, no, we are still young countries. We're still young democracies.
Well, 50-year-olds are still running as youth. So.
Yeah, 50 years old, 50-year-olds running as youth. that's the iron of it. But Israel, for example, that we credit with so much influence all over the world, is 60 years old. Okay. Yes, created in 1959.
No, 60. It's actually gone it's like 70 years now.
70 years. Yeah, about 70 years old. Nobody, you'd hear nobody anywhere in the world discussing about Israel, whether it's military, its political organization, its economy, or anything, as a young country. And yet, that's a country that was created from nothing. People gathered back together in a territory and started building a country. These countries that we're talking about have been here before the colonialists came. They have only evolved. It's the leadership that has changed from colonialism to some sort of independence. So why don't people calculate and say, Kabila, you're familiar with the Congo story better than anyone else. He was able at least to know where I have pushed these extra 2 years is the furthest I can go.
I don't think that's I actually don't think that was the situation. And if you're going to look at Congo as an example, you're going to look at the fact that he did try to change the constitution.
Yes, he did.
He failed. Actually, he passed it in the lower house when it went to their Senate. He realized, he realized there was an uprising, that people are already on the streets. A lot of them died. So he realized, you know what, this thing should be left alone. Then
some people are willing to let more people.
Then he went into, they went to the Constitutional Court, and he was made custodian, not president, but custodian of the country for about 2 years. He was keeping the country until they have elections. I think if we're going to look at this, let's understand that, one, I think we got a concept. Independence, like I'll agree with Timothy on this. A change of events was happening really quick. So you have the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Germans who are going to give independence to a group of people. So what do? They panel beat some civil servants, give them their countries. Now we are given a concept or a way of life that was not necessarily ours. Leadership in Africa, if you look at even how people govern from their homes to their companies, we are basically, for lack of better words, we are chiefs and kings in the way we think. If Irene is now president, she will not want to be told anything. People want to be that supreme leader. So you get African countries where Captain Mike Mukula is now president. In his head, he is the king of the country. He will follow, is following a system that originally, or if you look at Africans, I don't think we understood the concept of democracy. Because if you even go, like he mentioned earlier, to the US, they are still, because Americans, you know how their elections are held. The people themselves don't actually vote for the president. Okay? It's like their vote is a popularity contest. But I think we got a system as Africans.
The actual decision is made by the electoral
Yes,
college.
by an electoral college. Now, we got a system as Africans. Justice Kanyahamba once said his vote and that of a peasant should not be equal. I think I remember reading that somewhere. And most people may have thought him, you know, why has he said that? But you're giving people an election. Captain Mike Mukula, I think he has participated in the most elections. He will tell you, there are people you don't go to them and talk to them about policies. You don't go to them and give them all these grand ideas of what you want to do. Their issues are bread and butter issues. Now, if you can fix food issues, you can stay as long as you want. Now, when you talk about why don't these people cut the deals, because guess what? There is, as leaders, as politicians, I think they always think we will also get through this. You know, we got through the last crisis, we'll get through the next crisis. So it comes to a point where, and you cannot dismiss influence, external influence in this whole thing, because it has to be funded. Those people on the streets, you will not say that they were there. In Burundi, they tried it. They had people in Bujumbura getting on the streets and all that. Now, the other thing that failed is what Captain Mukula talked about in the beginning. Look at the population of Burundi. How much of it is urban? How much of it is rural? The people in the rural communities of Burundi were not willing to come to Bujumbura to continue with these protests. Okay? So when you have a huge number, he has talked about 2 cities of Sudan having 70% of the population.
That's correct.
Of course, if you look at almost every single leading, almost every single government in Africa, in the world, the incumbent or the current president never wins an election in the cities.
Captain, let me come to you. That's same question, and it strikes home for you. You were part of the Central Executive Committee that endorsed President Museveni running again, saying the transition, the appetite to keep postponing that critical question of how do we transition within the individual political parties at the national level is what sometimes leads these leaders to end up the way they have ended. There was talk about Gaddafi and him handing over to his son, or grooming a successor as a son, or part of the revolution that he brought to power. The same question was asked about Hosni Mubarak. The same question was asked about Robert Mugabe and his comrades. The same question was asked about Bashir. The same question was asked anybody you go to, anywhere where there's been a collapse. The question is asked, but it never gets discussed. And then at the end of the day, there's humiliation. Why?
Well, you asked a question about Central Executive Committee. We have not closed the gates.
I used it as an example.
Yes.
Yes.
But we have not closed the gates on our part. Anybody who wants can come in. Our position was a recommendation. A recommendation is different from a policy position. The national resistance movement, for that matter, let me bring it home. Our position is we think that in the last 33 years, we've been in power. The last 30 years, we've been fighting groups that have been attempting to overthrow the constitution. And even so, when we had attained all these other opportunities of bringing total peace and security to the country, in the last 3 years, you saw that there was again an upsurge of urban insecurity in the areas of Wakiso, the killings of the sheikhs, the killing of Kawes, and so on and so forth. And that put us into a point of now recruiting the 6,000 people and putting the cameras. We think that as a party, the country still has a number of threats, and we still need to ensure that we consolidate this peace. And we as a party, I'm not talking for any other organization, I'm talking for the party. We think that in order to consolidate total peace in the country, because ADF is still simmering across the DRC, you still have threats across the Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. We still have the instability in South Sudan, and we don't know what spillover effect will have in this area. And that's why we said, can we have you continue in this direction? And that will be decided by the supreme body, and that is the National Conference. But let me come to answer your question.
Yes.
Where do Africans come in managing the transition? And I want to assure you that on the side of the national resistance movement, we have the capacity, because we have the institutional framework to manage a transition. If today President Museveni became incapacitated in whichever way as the constitution prescribes, we will manage that transition very well as a party. And there would be nobody who would say that NRM will fail to pick leaders within the framework to govern this country.
I would imagine 1st December, that was exactly the same discussion that was happening in Sudan.
No.
I would imagine that just before the fall of Gaddafi, that was exactly the discussion, because no one on the African continent believed that Gaddafi would go the way he did. I would imagine that was the discussion that was happening in Egypt. I would imagine that was the discussion that was happening in Algeria. Just a moment. In Algeria, just before the protests on the street, forced Abdelaziz Bouteflika to say, wait a minute, where we are now, and his inner core to tell him, no, Mzee, this can't go on longer. We must make a decision. Then he makes one announcement, and then makes a second announcement in quick succession. The discussion before, the confidence before, is always the same. When actually things turn around, you realize, you say, hey, you know, you keep postponing and saying, no, you know, I will plan. And then you fall in an accident or something happens, and people look and say, but hey, we thought Charles was an organized person. What happened?
Let me tell you, Charles, and let me be very candid about this. You have had leaders, even in more developed democracies like, for example, United Kingdom. Margaret Thatcher was in power for a long time.
How many years?
I think she was in power for
11 years.
I think she was slightly close to 12 years.
Yeah, about 12 years. That's not a long time.
Yeah, but they had regular elections. The German Chancellor, how long has she been in power? How long has she been re-elected? Again, so I want to tell you that all these democracies have passed their own routes. All these emerging democracies in Africa, where you have been able to bring in this democratic dispensation, democratic elections being carried out, all of them and all these institutions that you're talking about they've gotten their own levels of political maturity. It will take time for the African continent to mature internal democratic processes, but all said and done, the stability of a country is paramount and is number one. And that's why you find that most of the time, political parties that are in power, especially revolutionary parties, evaluate where we have come from, where we are today, and where we are going to move, so that we leave a firm foundation for emerging Democrats, those who will come in. It does not matter whether it is the opposition.
Which country has succeeded in doing that on the African continent?
And that's why I'm
Ghana.
saying that
Ghana
has done that very well.
Since J.J. Rawlings, they have succeeded.
South Africa's ANC has done that very well.
What has been the longest regime in Ghana?
Kenya has done that very
Which
well.
government lived longest in Ghana?
Tanzania has done that very well. Zambia has done that very well. So when you're saying that
and there
is no deficiency.
They have transformed their countries.
Well,
Yes, they have.
they have.
In terms of what?
In terms of growth. You
Which
see,
which growth? Tanzania?
how far have you
Tanzania,
traveled in the region?
Zambia.
How far have you traveled in the
No,
region?
yeah, I have traveled.
I thought you only read this in
No.
in Google.
No, I have traveled. I've been some of those countries you're talking about.
Yes,
And I'm looking at the transformation you're talking about. I'm looking at the poverty levels. I'm looking at the life of the people who live in those countries, and I don't see the transformation you're talking about.
Sub-Saharan Africa
Yes.
has got almost the same paradigms, almost the same levels. when you talk about spikes,
Is
they are
Sub-Saharan Africa cast by God?
No,
Why does it have the same
no,
paradigm
but
of
look at
poverty,
our history.
of death, of disease,
Ring
and
fencing
of
positions.
leaders who keep telling us we're building a foundation? They never build the foundation.
That's
No,
a
no, you're
utopian.
Charles,
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 that's a
no.
utopian position.
No, Captain.
That is utopian.
Captain, you're talking about Tanzania. And you look at Tanzania and you say, so what's the difference? Really? You're talking about Zimbabwe, you're talking about Zambia, you're talking about these other
No, but
countries.
Charles,
What
Charles.
is that transformation?
Charles, the evolution of Africa is not going to be prescribed as it is, as it were in Genesis chapter 1.
Yes,
Let
I
there
gave,
be and it was.
gave an
It is a
example.
process.
I gave an example of Israel. It was not a country 70 years ago. It's a country that doesn't talk about
Do you
its
know
age.
how much?
It's a
Do you know
country
how
that
much
doesn't talk
United
about,
States
No, it-
injects into Israel
just a
every
moment.
year?
Yes.
Do we know how
$3
much?
billion.
Yes. How much does? How much have these countries received in foreign aid?
No, Charles.
Do they-
when
do
you're
they
talking
face the
about,
same odds
we
as
talked
these other
about,
countries?
we talked
Charles,
about
that
one
is
thing.
a pie in the sky.
We talked about one thing that you keep missing.
Yes.
In the beginning, when my first statement, I talked about change in leadership, and by change in leadership, I do not mean the head of state. When J.J. Rawlings came to Ghana, what he did is he took back the army to the barracks. From 1957, when Ghana got independence, until Rawlings took over, they had been having successions of coups. Like we're seated on this table, I overthrow Captain Mike overthrows Timothy overthrows Charles, and it would keep rotating that way. From the time Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by Kotoka. Now, you go into today where you have, they stabilized. What Captain Mukula was talking about is first stabilize the country. First get the army out of get the army back into the barracks.
I hear you.
Then
That's
you start
exactly-
now. Ghana
that's
where it is,
exactly
where
what-
Ghana is
That's exactly the
is
argument.
when you talk about transformation.
That's exactly the argument that Gaddafi was raising since his coup in 1969 until he fell in 2011. That's exactly what Hosni Mubarak was talking about after his
No,
coup.
but I'm giving you
That's
a
exactly-
specific
no,
example. You
Charles,
asked about the
just a
transformation.
moment.
I'm giving you a
That's
Charles,
specific
exactly
you are
the same
example.
comparing. You're
That's
comparing.
exactly the same argument.
You're
Bashir
comparing
was
two
making
different fruits.
from the time he took over in 1989 to the time he failed in
Yes, but
2019.
I have given you an example.
exactly the
J.J.
same argument.
Rawlings took over power. He ruled, had elections, and went back. He is
Yes,
seated. Now,
he had-
you are talking about transformation.
J.J. Rawlings is the wrong example here
Why?
because J.J. Rawlings lives in Ghana. The other day they were showing him getting out of traffic and directing traffic when it was raining
Yes.
because he knew when to quit.
No, but
The
we're not
other
refuting.
leaders,
We're not
he
refuting
knew-
that. You talked
he
about
knew-
transformation.
He knew the time to stabilize the country and hand it over to other people. In these other countries, they haven't known that. Timothy, you have the last
No,
word on
Charles,
this show.
you're being very academic about
I am
political
not.
formation. Very academic. Let me give you a very clear
Yes.
position, and very quickly too.
Uh.
The Sahel, the Arabs, have lived through either autocratic systems. Gaddafi did not have a constitution. He never, throughout the 42 years, never held internal elections.
Yes.
It was not there were
Why
no
did he
political
promise in
parties.
1969?
No. There were no political parties. When you look at countries like Morocco, there are no internal elections. When you look at a country like Iraq, when you look at countries like Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth, you will see that that's the formation, the culture,
Style
and the
of governance.
structure and style of governance in most Arab countries.
Captain,
To try to force democracy into these
Captain,
countries
we are
is looking
trying-
for a tall order, and that's
No,
what has happened.
these
An
other countries,
abortion of
especially
governance
Sub-Saharan
in
Africa,
Iraq.
have moved to hide behind elections, which by their own admission, they say is imposed on them. They can't sustain the other system. They adopt a system they complain about. So they are countries of leaders who complain and never get to do the things they're supposed to do. Timothy, you have the last word. I promised that we'll discuss Idi Amin. Make a statement on Idi Amin's 40 years of Idi Amin, and then
Sudan.
you want to do Sudan? It's okay.
Africans are just lousy people. Let me just put it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Maybe
You realize you are part of us.
Well, yes.
You realize
Timothy has a
we are together in this one.
I can say
Timothy,
I can look into the
I am-
camera.
I'm
so
an African.
difficult to say.
Yes,
And
all
I'm
of
not
us,
lousy.
from our panel here to the viewers to the societies, people, let's just face these blunt facts.
Yes.
They've introduced all these presidential term limits in the Malawi, Zambia, Senegal, Zimbabwe. Just look at them. What's the difference? Plus or minus 3-2%, we're just the same countries. If you don't get into the structure of the culture, the society, I think Captain Mukula is hinting at that to some degree. But my point of view is our problem is not so much the politics, but our productivity as societies. that is that you can have all these term limits, you can have everything, you can have free and fair elections, but just see, look at all our roads, our dams, and all this not being built by us, by the Chinese.
The others were built by the Europeans.
Which
The next round is being built by the Chinese.
And
Our time
imagine
is
we
out.
have
Our time is
populations.
out. Our time is out. We need to get out of here.
And we have
I'm afraid.
populations that go
Thank
to
you
school.
very much. Thank you. Yeah, we have more students going to school, and
the lousiest people on this planet are Africans, and that is a
No.
problem.
A black man,
Had it
the
from me.
Africans are very
Look at
solid
Haiti.
and
Haiti
very,
got
very brilliant
Haiti
people.
got independence 26
We'll
years
have
after
a
America.
discussion.
We're only
Look
going
at
through a
Haiti.
phase
Haiti is just some-
I disagree.
Haiti
There is
disagree
very
with-
little Africans can do.
Haiti got independence.
No, I don't
in
agree with
1806.
that.
I don't
There's
agree
a
with
lot
that
we
position.
can do.
No, in
disagree
some
with that.
situations, when
I
you want to
disagree
do
with
I
something,
that.
you
stand
can't
by
do
my
anything.
statement.
Yes, I disagree.
That
with
is
you
your
on that.
opinion.
He
That's
knows
your
that.
opinion.
That's why I say it's my
Our time is
statement.
out. We need to get out of here. Thank you very much, Irene Kizo Nyango. Thank you very much, Fabrice Brad Olinda. Thank you very much, Captain George Mike Mukula.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy Nyakahuma Kaligira.
Lousy Africans.
Thank you very much, you all our viewers. for
There's the
joining us
lousy
tonight,
African.
as always. Thank you very much, the production crew that's here placed to deliver the show to you and to you all our viewers. This debate continues on our social media platforms, especially Twitter, WhatsApp, and Facebook. For me, it's a good night.